The attorney's hands trembled as he broke the wax seal. It was June 17th, 1854, and the parlor at Belmont Manor in Nachez, Mississippi, had never been so silent. 15 people sat in that room, each holding their breath, as James Whitfield unfolded a document that would ignite a scandal, so explosive it threatened to reach far beyond the confines of the manor. The air was thick with tension. The scent of beeswax and polished mahogany mingled with the unspoken dread of those present. Whitfield, a man in his late 40s, had earned a reputation as both a shrewd businessman and a conservative member of Nachez society. Yet, as he carefully revealed the contents of the parchment, even his composure faltered. The room seemed to contract, the walls bearing witness to a drama that would linger in the minds of everyone, present for decades to come. Belmont Manor itself was a reflection of its owner's ambition and wealth. White columns rose from the brick foundation, framing the grand entrance, while intricate ironwork adorned the balconies above. Outside, the gardens were meticulously maintained, a testament to the prestige of the Whitfield name. But on that June morning, the grandeur of the manor was overshadowed by the gravity of the unfolding events inside. The document in Whitfield's hands was a will and instrument that would disrupt the carefully calibrated order of inheritance, loyalty, and power that had long governed the household and its surrounding community. Witnesses later described a palpable shift as Whitfield read aloud, the words carrying weight far heavier than the paper could contain. Names were invoked that should not have been, assets reallocated in ways that challenged social norms, and intentions revealed that defied the expectations of all who were present. Among the 15, some gasped quietly, others exchanged glances fraught with disbelief. The attorney, standing beside Whitfield, remained outwardly composed, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of shock. For months, rumors had swirled around Belmont Manor, whispers of secret affairs, financial mismanagement, and concealed documents. Yet nothing had prepared those assembled for the revelations, now spilling into the open with every deliberate word, outside the parlor. The sounds of the Mississippi summer pressed against the windows, an incongruous reminder of life continuing. Unknowing, just beyond the walls of the manor, a servant quietly swept the hallway, pausing briefly at the threshold to witness the subtle trembling of Whitfield's hands. Within the room, discussions of propriety and legality mingled with the raw emotional impact of what was being disclosed. For many, this was more than a matter of money or property. It was a moral reckoning. The implications would ripple through Nachez society, challenging assumptions of loyalty, honor, and family hierarchy that had long gone unquestioned. By the time the final line was read, a heavy silence settled. Whitfield folded the will with careful precision, the snap of parchment sounding louder than it should have, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension and now released it in that small, definitive sound. Eyes remained fixed on him, some brimming with barely contained outrage, others clouded with fear and uncertainty. In the weeks that followed, the repercussions would unfold like a storm across Belmont Manor, leaving a trail of scandal, suspicion, and fractured relationships that would not fade for years. The events of June 17, 1854 were not merely a family dispute. They were a reflection of the fragile veneer of civility upon which the wealth and influence of Nachez rested. The room remained suspended in a tense hush long after the will had been read. Guests and family members alike sat, unsure whether to speak, to protest, or simply to absorb the enormity of what had transpired. The names enumerated in the will caused a quiet uproar among those seated closest to Whitfield, individuals who had assumed unquestionable inheritance and control over the estate's holdings. Now, with a few deliberate strokes of ink, their positions were appended. Among the most shocking revelations was the allocation of specific parcels of property to individuals, previously considered outsiders or socially inferior. In the rigid hierarchy of Nachez society, this was not merely unconventional, it was unthinkable. James Whitfield's face remained calm, almost stoic, but a flicker of something, perhaps regret, perhaps fear, passed across his features as he observed the reactions around him. For years he had meticulously managed Belmont Manor and its affiliated properties, maintaining a reputation of prudence and careful discretion. Yet the contents of this single document threatened to undo decades of cultivated social and economic authority. The attorney, a man whose sharp eyes had long dissected legal documents with clinical precision, now sat quietly, recognizing that this will contain ambiguities, hidden clauses, and implications that could fuel litigation for years to come, asterisk among those present. A notable tension arose between immediate family members. Some attempted to mask their surprise with the rigid politeness customary of Southern elites, while others struggled to contain visible displays of dismay. Whispers began to ripple through the room, punctuated by the occasional audible intake of breath. It was a subtle symphony of shock, and within its cadence lay the beginnings of familial fracture. Eyes darted furtively from one figure to another, seeking silent confirmation that others, too, understood the scope of what had just been revealed. Asterisk outside the parlor. The warm June sun glinted off the Mississippi River, creating a serene backdrop that contrasted sharply with the undercurrents of tension inside. Belmont Manor, the world beyond the walls, seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding, carrying on with an innocence and simplicity that sharply opposed the complicated web of secrets, obligations, and expectations bound within the walls of the manor. Yet within, each heartbeat seemed magnified, each glance weighted with potential consequence. For some, the revelation of the will's contents felt like a personal betrayal. For others, it was an opportunity, a rare glimpse at power temporarily in flux. Asterisk Whitfield, aware of the murmurs and the shifting energy, leaned back slightly in his chair, allowing the attorney to interject clarifications and explanations. Legal precision was necessary. In a matter as charged as this, any misstatement could compound scandal into outright catastrophe. The attorney read aloud sections detailing the distribution of financial assets, the disposition of enslaved individuals across plantations, and the allocation of property titles that had been presumed immutable. Each clause seemed to ripple through the room, unsettling not only the immediate recipients but also the broader network of merchants, neighbors, and associates whose livelihoods were tied to Belmont Manor's operations. Asterisk among the onlookers. Mrs. Clara Whitfield, James's elder sister, displayed an outward composure that belied the storm within. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, scanned the room, noting subtle reactions and calculating the repercussions. Though outwardly restrained, her mind raced through scenarios of legal challenge, social backlash, and the possible erosion of the Whitfield name. In her view, family honor and societal perception were inseparable. To lose control over either was unthinkable. Yet, as the final paragraphs of the will were read, even she could not ignore the implications that were impossible to reconcile with the meticulously constructed order of Belmont Manor. Asterisk, the echoes of that morning would extend far beyond the parlor. Discussions held in hushed tones in the hallways, exchanges over afternoon tea, and letters dispatched under the guise of propriety would carry the ripples of scandal throughout Nachez society. Each observer, aware that they had witnessed a moment that could alter lives, could not help but consider the fragile nature of fortune, power, and human expectation. That day, Belmont Manor became more than a residence. It became a crucible, a place where reputation, morality, and legality collided with such force that the consequences would haunt its occupants and their descendants for decades. Asterisk. The aftermath of the will's revelation set into motion a sequence of events that would ripple through Belmont Manor and Nachez society alike. Guests lingered uncomfortably, reluctant to leave, bound by curiosity, loyalty, and fear of being implicated in the emerging drama. The air, once perfumed with polished wood and candle wax, now felt thick and oppressive, as though the walls themselves were bearing witness to the unspoken tension. The attorney carefully collected the will and accompanying documents, placing them into a leather-bound case, yet even this act seemed ceremonial rather than final. The truth of what had been disclosed lingered uncontained, floating above the polished floors like a specter of inevitable conflict. Asterisk. James Whitfield rose from his chair with deliberate slowness. Every movement was measured, intended to convey control even as the consequences of the will loomed large. For him, the document was both a burden and a confession, a record of intentions shaped by years of private calculations, secrets and ambitions. The arrangement of assets, the designations of heirs, and the stipulations regarding property and influence were precise. Yet they challenged the social order that had long underpinned his authority. Those seated around him perceived the subtle tremor in his hand, a quiet admission that even he, the author of the will's logic, could not fully anticipate the storm it would unleash. In the corner. Young Charles Whitfield, James's nephew, shifted uneasily. He had long expected to inherit both the manor and its surrounding properties, his future meticulously planned in the private musings of his uncle. Now, with each carefully chosen clause read aloud, his sense of inevitability crumbled. He glanced furtively at the attorney, searching for reassurance or clarification, but the man's face offered none. The written word, once a tool of certainty and order, now served as a herald of disarray. In his mind, the carefully constructed hierarchy of Belmont Manor was being dismantled, not with confrontation or violence, but with ink and the deliberate cadence of a practiced reader. Outside the parlor. The summer breeze whispered through the gardens, rustling the magnolia trees in a sound that contrasted sharply with the heavy, deliberate silence inside. The world beyond Belmont Manor seemed untroubled, yet for those within, each moment held the weight of potential calamity. The staff of the house moved quietly through the hallways, their eyes downcast, aware of the extraordinary nature of the morning's proceedings. Servants who had long known the rhythm and expectations of the estate now observed a subtle shift, sensing the tension radiating from the family's core. Even the quietest corners of the manor seemed imbued with anticipation, as if the walls themselves absorbed the gravity of the revelations. As the reading concluded, Whitfield began to deliberate privately with the attorney. His voice, low and measured, carried an undertone of urgency. Decisions needed to be made about immediate communication, potential legal challenges, and the delicate management of relatives whose sense of entitlement had been disrupted. Outside, those waiting in the gardens whispered among themselves, speculating on the contents of the will, imagining alliances, betrayals, and disputes yet to unfold. The knowledge of what had transpired inside the parlor spread like wildfire through the estate, eventually reaching neighboring plantations, merchants, and officials. By evening, Belmont Manor had assumed the aura of a place suspended in time, caught between the old order and the uncertainties ushered in by a single document. Candles flickered in the dim light, casting shadows that seemed to dance along the walls with a life of their own. Conversations in hushed tones, careful gestures, and unspoken assumptions filled the air as the household adjusted to the reality that nothing would ever be the same. Each family member, each guest, and each servant now understood that the manor had become a crucible of ambition, secrecy, and fragile loyalties. The events of that day were more than a disruption of property. They were a revelation of human complexity, vulnerability, and the quiet yet explosive power of the written word. Night descended upon Belmont Manor with a heavy, almost palpable weight. The grand parlor, so recently filled with murmurs and the subtle tensions of inheritance disputes, now stood empty, its silence punctuated only by the occasional creak of floorboards and the distant hum of the Mississippi River outside. Gas lamps flickered in their wall sconces, casting long, wavering shadows across the polished wood and richly embroidered draperies. The house, in all its ostentation and grandeur, seemed suddenly fragile, as if the walls themselves could no longer support the weight of human expectation and disappointment that had been poured into the room earlier that day. James. Whitfield retreated to his private study, the leather-bound will resting carefully on the desk before him. His eyes lingered on the familiar ink, tracing the deliberate curves and flourishes of the cursive script that had so thoroughly altered the course of his household. Each clause carried implications that reached far beyond the room in which it had been read, threatening to unravel alliances, friendships, and the perceived stability of the Whitfield legacy. For a man accustomed to control, to meticulous planning, and to the quiet obedience of those around him, the knowledge that the future of Belmont Manor now contained elements of uncertainty was almost unbearable. Outside the study, the manor's corridors were quiet but not empty. Servants moved with silent precision, carrying out their evening duties with an awareness sharpened by the morning's revelations. Every glance, every whispered word seemed to measure the shifting hierarchies within the household. Who had been favored by the new arrangements? Who had been deprived of expected inheritance? And perhaps most crucially, what alliances or resentments might these changes spark in the days to come? The subtleties of observation, so crucial in a house of rigid social and familial structure, now assumed an almost strategic importance. Meanwhile, James's cousin, Frederick Whitfield, lingered in the guest wing, his own thoughts turbulent. He had been a peripheral figure in the family's affairs, often dismissed in discussions of estate management and succession. Now, the clauses of the will offered him an opportunity previously unimaginable. Yet with this opportunity came a weight of quiet awareness that advantage, once gained, was always accompanied by risk. Frederick could sense, as clearly as any observer, that Belmont Manor had entered a period of flux where old certainties were suspended, and where missteps, even those unintentional, could have profound consequences. Elsewhere in the manor, the housekeeper, Mrs. Caldwell, worked with meticulous care, her hands folding linens and arranging silverware, as if to impose order on a household that had just been shaken to its foundations. She had witnessed the reading, had felt the charged atmosphere, and knew the fragility of social equilibrium in such a place. In her quiet, practical way, she understood that the reactions of the family would echo for weeks, and that the servants' lives, too, were inextricably bound to the unfolding drama. Her presence, unseen and unremarked by the elite members of the household, nevertheless offered a stabilizing counterpoint, a quiet testament to experience and vigilance in the midst of upheaval. By midnight, the manor seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The grand halls, empty of human presence, carried the residual tension, the weight of whispered calculations, and the echo of unspoken fears. The future, uncertain and precarious, had begun to settle into the very fabric of Belmont Manor, and as the candles guttered and smoke curled toward the ceiling, the house seemed to whisper a singular truth: the events set in motion by a single will would not be contained by walls or by propriety. They would ripple through the lives of all who resided within and beyond the estate, their consequences unfolding silently, inexorably, across days, months, and perhaps years. The following morning, Belmont Manor awoke under a thick, gray veil of fog that seemed to mirror the uncertainty gripping its residents. Couriers arrived from Nachez, bearing messages from extended family, legal representatives, and creditors who had learned, by word of mouth or innuendo, of the will's contents. Each knock at the heavy doors, each carriage rumbling across the gravel drive, added tension to the morning air. Inside, the household moved with a careful rhythm, everyone aware that every word, every glance, might carry unintended meaning in a house suddenly charged with suspicion and fragile egos. James Whitfield convened an early meeting in the study with the attorney and several trusted family advisors. The conversation, hushed but urgent, focused on immediate priorities: the secure storage of the will, the preparation of formal notifications to relevant parties, and the careful orchestration of the initial communication to family members not present for the reading. Each point was debated with deliberate caution. The attorney, skilled in both law and diplomacy, emphasized precision, reminding James that a misstep could result in prolonged litigation, reputational damage, and fracturing of already strained family relations. In the parlor, Charles Whitfield and his sister Anne lingered, attempting to decipher the implications of clauses that seemed both generous and restrictive. Charles's eyes lingered on the passages granting specific properties to distant relatives, while Anne focused on provisions related to personal effects, including jewelry and fine furnishings. They shared occasional glances, their expressions a mix of frustration, incredulity, and a dawning comprehension that Belmont Manor's hierarchy, long considered immutable, was being recalibrated by forces beyond their control. The reading of the will had exposed the fragility of expectation and the unpredictable power of written law. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters, whispers circulated rapidly. Though many of the household staff had little understanding of legal matters, they sensed the change in atmosphere. Tasks were executed with heightened awareness, eyes darting to family members and visitors alike, reading not only the tone of speech, but the subtler cues of movement, hesitation, and expression. For them, the will was both abstract and profoundly tangible, a symbol of shifting authority that might alter not only allegiances within the household, but the rhythms of labor, punishment, and privilege that had long governed daily life. By mid-morning, the first external visitors arrived, local magistrates and acquaintances who had been invited, delicately to witness or confirm procedural aspects of the will's reading. They entered with the studied decorum appropriate to the upper echelons of Nachez society, but their eyes betrayed curiosity and speculation. Each step through the polished hallways, each exchange of polite but loaded words, reinforced the sense that Belmont Manor was now a theater of both legal process and human drama. The interactions were punctuated by the occasional twinge of envy, cautious calculation, or subtle power play, none of which escaped the careful observation of those who understood that fortune and inheritance were always at the mercy of perception. As the day wore on, James Whitfield withdrew periodically to the private study, reviewing the will's clauses and the meticulous annotations he had made over years. His contemplation was both tactical and personal. He considered the ramifications for familial relationships, the potential for disputes, and the management of the estate's operations, which required careful stewardship in the absence of certainty. Outside, the fading fog began to lift, but inside the manor, a tension persisted, palpable and unyielding. Belmont Manor had entered a new era, one where propriety and expectation would clash with the reality of human ambition, inheritance, and secrecy. Every resident, from the highest-ranking family member to the quietest servant, felt the tremor that a single document had set into motion. By late afternoon, the subtle tensions within Belmont Manor had begun to crystallize into a more discernible pattern. Servants moved with an almost imperceptible caution, aware that the smallest gesture or slip of speech could attract scrutiny or unintentionally reveal allegiance. Those who had once considered themselves secure in the routine of the household now found themselves navigating a web of expectations they had never anticipated. The corridors, long echoing with the predictable rhythm of daily activity, carried a quiet undercurrent of unease. Even the usual sounds, the distant chime of the clock tower, the rustle of silk skirts, the soft steps of children, were somehow muted, as though the house itself sensed the tremor of change. James Whitfield, increasingly aware of the fragile equilibrium surrounding him, retreated periodically to the upper study, a room filled with books, papers, and the faint aroma of aged wood. Here he sought both clarity and control, poring over the text of the will, reviewing the annotations made by the attorney, and considering the practical implications of each clause. Every detail, from the disposition of land to the assignment of personal effects, demanded careful attention. He understood that any oversight could provoke disputes with long-reaching consequences, not only legal, but social and potentially violent. The family's reactions were equally complex. Charles Whitfield, though outwardly composed, had begun keeping meticulous mental notes on the distribution of the estate. He calculated what he might gain or lose in both material and symbolic terms, balancing ambition with caution. And Whitfield, quieter but no less perceptive, observed interactions with a keen eye, reading not only her siblings but also the subtle shifts in expression among the extended family who had gathered. Their behavior, she realized, was a reflection of both envy and fear, and she understood that these sentiments, if left unchecked, could reshape the dynamics of Belmont Manor in ways both subtle and dramatic. Meanwhile, the servants' quarters were alive with speculation. Long-serving staff, aware of patterns within the household, whispered among themselves. Some noted the way James Whitfield retreated for private consultation with the attorney, interpreting it as both prudent and telling. Others speculated about who might be favored or marginalized, who might gain status or suffer oversight. Even the youngest of the servants, who had once moved about with carefree obedience, now seemed to approach each task with a wary awareness of eyes both seen and unseen. The household had become a theater in which every action, no matter how routine, carried weight beyond its immediate purpose. As evening approached, the light through the tall windows cast elongated shadows across the parlor and hallways. The golden glow of the gas lamps mingled with the fading daylight, creating a chiaroscuro that seemed to mirror the conflicting emotions within the house: anticipation, anxiety, and the lingering echo of whispered secrets. In the drawing room, the family gathered for a quiet supper, though conversation was tentative, measured, and filled with pauses pregnant with unspoken thought. Even laughter, when it arose, seemed constrained, as though each sound could inadvertently reveal knowledge or preference. Outside, the river continued its steady flow, indifferent to the human concerns that now dominated the estate. The world beyond Belmont Manor moved at its own pace, yet within the walls, time seemed to stretch and condense, dominated by the influence of the will and its ramifications. James Whitfield, in particular, felt the weight of responsibility pressing down with a near physical intensity. Each decision, each word spoken or withheld, carried implications that might ripple far into the future. In that moment, Belmont Manor existed in a suspended reality caught between the formalities of legal documentation and the fragile, unpredictable nature of human behavior. The following morning brought with it an uneasy stillness, a quiet that contrasted sharply with the swirling undercurrents of tension that had filled Belmont Manor since the reading of the will. James Whitfield, aware of the fragile state of affairs, moved through the house with deliberate purpose, observing every interaction, every subtle expression. He had learned that appearances could be deceptive. A smile might conceal resentment, a bow of the head might signal calculated deference. In a household long accustomed to rigid hierarchy, the introduction of uncertainty had amplified every gesture into a potential message, every silence into a statement. In the library, James spent hours reviewing correspondence, cross-referencing family letters with the legal annotations provided by the attorney. Each clause of the will seemed to ripple outward, altering not only the expected inheritance, but the established social equilibrium within Nachez society. He considered the distant relatives mentioned, those who might challenge the document's interpretation, and the local magistrates who had agreed to witness its reading. Each calculation demanded care, for a single misstep could ignite disputes that would reach far beyond the immediate confines of Belmont Manor. And Whitfield, observing the household with a quiet intensity, began to understand the subtle strategies required to navigate this new reality. She noticed the carefully measured movements of her brothers, the indirect glances exchanged with cousins, and the whispered exchanges among the household staff, and recognized that the power dynamics she had once taken for granted were now in flux. Influence, once inherited or assumed, now required skillful management, observation, and in some cases, manipulation. Her reflections, though internal and unspoken, shaped the decisions she would make in the days to come, influencing both how she presented herself and how she interpreted the actions of those around her. Among the servants, speculation grew more pointed. Long-serving staff, sensitive to the nuances of the family's behavior, whispered about what the future might hold. Certain attendants who had previously enjoyed favor found themselves reassessing their positions, while others saw opportunity in the subtle shifts of influence. Gossip, though never spoken aloud beyond trusted ears, traveled quickly along corridors and through hidden passages. Each observation, each inference carried potential consequences, for the household now functioned as both a domestic space and a microcosm of social negotiation, where even minor errors could have lasting implications. By late afternoon, James convened a private meeting with the attorney to discuss potential contingencies. Their discussion, technical and precise, revolved around possible disputes, property claims, and the safeguarding of assets in the event that distant relatives attempted legal challenges. The attorney emphasized the importance of documentation, suggesting that careful records of conversations, observations, and financial transactions could serve as protection against future claims. James listened attentively, recognizing that his role had shifted from executor of family tradition to active guardian of both legacy and reputation. Outside, the estate grounds appeared serene, the sprawling gardens and manicured lawns offering a deceptive calm. Yet the calm belied the emotional turbulence within the house. Family members moved with restrained awareness, servants attended their tasks with a new caution, and the very walls seemed to hold the echoes of anticipation and apprehension. Every room, every hallway seemed to carry the weight of possibility, the potential for conflict or revelation. Belmont Manor had transformed, subtly yet irrevocably, into a space where law, ambition, and human psychology intertwined, creating a theater in which the outcome remained uncertain, as evening fell. James retired once more to the study, the warm glow of the lamp casting elongated shadows across his papers. He reflected on the fragile nature of order and the intricate interplay of power, wealth, and human desire. Belmont Manor, with all its elegance and tradition, now existed in a liminal state, a place suspended between inherited expectation and unpredictable reality, where every decision, every glance, and every silence carried significance beyond measure. The tension was tangible, almost suffocating, and James understood that the coming days would test not only legal acumen but emotional resilience, judgment, and the ability to navigate the complex currents of both family and society. The next morning dawned with a brittle clarity, the sunlight filtering through tall windows in thin, measured beams that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. Belmont Manor, with its high ceilings and polished floors, seemed almost to hold its breath. The previous day's discussions with the attorney had left James Whitfield restless, pacing the study, reviewing each clause of the will, and re-examining every possible scenario that might threaten the fragile control he now held. Outside, the estate's familiar rhythms persisted, the distant clatter of horses' hooves, the rustle of trees in the morning wind, but inside, the household simmered with tension, each person aware that the future of Belmont Manor rested on careful navigation and keen observation. Servants moved with precise efficiency, their steps deliberate and eyes vigilant. Those who had served the Whitfields for decades now found themselves balancing familiarity with caution, ensuring that no unguarded word or subtle glance betrayed understanding of the family's private deliberations. Whispered conversations were confined to corners and behind closed doors, the air thick with speculation and interpretation. Long-standing alliances among the staff were tested, as old loyalties now contended with emerging opportunities, and each minor transgression or perceived favor could reverberate across the household with unforeseen consequences. Meanwhile, Anne Whitfield maintained a quiet vigilance, her presence at the breakfast table purposeful yet unobtrusive. She observed the nuances of her siblings' behavior, the tension in Charles's jaw, the carefully measured words of Margaret, the fleeting expressions of cousins who had traveled for the will's reading. Her mind catalogued each detail, analyzing patterns of behavior and anticipating responses to future events. In a household long governed by rigid social structures, Anne had discovered that influence now required strategy and patience. Every smile, every carefully placed word, could carry implications far beyond immediate comprehension. James, increasingly consumed by his responsibilities, began to understand that Belmont Manor had transformed into a landscape of power both visible and hidden. The will had introduced variables that disrupted the delicate balance of familial expectations, and the subtle currents of resentment, ambition, and loyalty now flowed beneath the surface of civility. Even the attorney's careful guidance could not account for the unpredictable nature of human behavior, and James recognized that legal precision alone was insufficient to maintain order. Emotional intelligence, vigilance, and an acute awareness of perception were equally crucial in safeguarding the estate and preserving both reputation and inheritance. By mid-morning, James convened a private council with two of the long-serving overseers, men whose knowledge of household operations and past precedents made them indispensable. Together, they reviewed the distribution of assets, the management of personnel, and the potential for disputes with distant relatives. James emphasized the importance of discretion, instructing the overseers to maintain strict confidentiality regarding any internal decisions or movements within the estate. The men, seasoned and cautious, nodded in understanding. Recognizing that Belmont Manor's stability now depended upon secrecy, prudence, and the careful management of both people and perception, outside, the estate grounds offered a stark contrast to the emotional turbulence inside. The gardens, meticulously tended, the gravel paths, and the expansive lawns reflected the Whitfields' insistence on order, beauty, and control. Yet beneath this surface lay the unspoken tensions, the private calculations, and the latent rivalries that now defined the household. Belmont Manor, for all its elegance, had become a crucible in which ambition, loyalty, and strategy intersected, each moment pregnant with possibility and danger. Every gesture, every conversation, and every glance carried weight, shaping the future of both the family and the estate itself. As dusk approached, James retreated once more to the study, where candlelight flickered across maps, ledgers, and letters. He contemplated the delicate balance he had inherited, aware that each decision might ripple outward, influencing not only legal outcomes but the very fabric of Belmont Manor's internal hierarchy. The estate, poised between tradition and uncertainty, awaited the next movement with attention that seemed almost tangible, a quiet storm of calculation, observation, and anticipation that would define the coming days. The evening settled over Belmont Manor with an almost oppressive stillness, the kind that seemed to amplify every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of fabric in the corridors. Candles flickered in sconces along the walls, casting dancing shadows that transformed familiar spaces into unfamiliar landscapes. In this half-light, the mansion became a place where the past and present coexisted uneasily, where the weight of expectation pressed on every occupant, and where secrets long buried threatened to emerge with the faintest provocation. James Whitfield moved carefully through the rooms, attentive to every sound, every gesture. The air was thick with anticipation, and he felt acutely that one misstep could unravel the fragile equilibrium that had been painstakingly maintained since the reading of the will. And Whitfield, meanwhile, observed her brothers and cousins from a quiet distance. She had grown adept at reading expressions, measuring the pauses in speech, and understanding what remained unspoken. Within the family, alliances were fluid and ever-shifting. Small gestures, an intentional nod, a delayed response, a fleeting glance revealed allegiances and intentions more clearly than words ever could. An ever-perceptive cataloged these details with meticulous care. She understood that Belmont Manor had become a stage upon which strategy and patience mattered more than brute force or overt assertion. The subtleties of human behavior now governed the fates of all within its walls. In the servants' quarters, speculation ran rampant. Long-standing staff whispered about new arrangements in the household, noting subtle changes in routines and the increasing frequency of private meetings with the attorney. Even those who had once enjoyed unquestioned favor sensed the precariousness of their positions. Observing these dynamics, James realized that the loyalty of the staff could not be taken for granted. He initiated quiet, deliberate measures to ensure compliance, offering reassurance while subtly reminding them of their obligations. These small interventions, though outwardly mundane, carried an unmistakable weight, reinforcing the hierarchy and maintaining the fragile order. Late into the night, James returned to the library where ledgers, letters, and legal documents were spread across the table. Each item demanded scrutiny, each detail required careful consideration. The estate's future depended on precision, vigilance, and foresight. Potential claimants, distant relatives, business associates, and even local authorities loomed as threats that could destabilize Belmont Manor's delicate balance. James reviewed every notation, every annotation, weighing not only the legal implications but the social consequences. He understood that in Natchez society, perception was as crucial as legality. The mere suggestion of impropriety could ignite scandal, and the ripples of such events would reach far beyond the immediate household. Meanwhile, and quietly observed from the study doorway. She had come to recognize that influence within Belmont Manor was not merely a matter of inheritance or social rank. It was an exercise in psychological acuity, a contest of patience, and an ongoing negotiation of perception. She considered her own role, the subtle ways in which she could shape outcomes without drawing overt attention. Knowledge, she realized, was power, but so too was timing, discretion, and the ability to anticipate desires and fears before they were articulated. By midnight, the mansion had quieted, yet the tension lingered in every corridor, every chamber. The household had become a living web of observation, calculation, and anticipation. Belmont Manor, outwardly serene, now existed as a dynamic organism in which every movement, every decision, and every word carried amplified significance. The night seemed almost alive with possibilities, each one threatening to shift the balance of power and influence in unpredictable ways. James lingered at the library window, staring into the moonlit gardens. He understood that the coming days would demand not only careful strategy, but an acute awareness of the hidden currents that ran through the family and household. Belmont Manor, elegant yet formidable, had become a crucible in which character, cunning, and resolve would be tested relentlessly. In that quiet, shadowed moment, he resolved to navigate these currents with vigilance, knowing that each step forward would carry consequences far beyond the walls of the estate itself. The following morning arrived with a muted brilliance, the sun struggling through a veil of thin clouds that hung over Belmont Manor like a hesitant promise. Within the house, the air carried a subtle tension, thickened by the events of the previous weeks and the delicate maneuvering required to navigate both family expectations and legal intricacies. James Whitfield began his day with deliberate attention to detail, reviewing correspondence from distant relatives and business associates, noting every inflection and nuance in the letters as though each could reveal hidden intentions. The written word, he understood, could conceal as much as it revealed, and deciphering the truth required more than cursory reading. It demanded insight, intuition, and patience. Anne Whitfield, observing from the drawing room, had already taken stock of the household. Her quiet vigilance had become a habit, one that allowed her to anticipate moments of tension before they manifested openly. She noticed subtle shifts in the servants' demeanor, the way glances lingered slightly longer than necessary, the slight stiffening in posture at certain mentions of the will, the estate's accounts, or James's decisions. The interplay between perception and reality had become a familiar landscape to her, one she traversed with deliberate caution. In this web of observation she discovered the nuanced power of silence, the force of unspoken understanding, and the influence of patient calculation. The estate's staff, while outwardly efficient, harbored quiet anxieties. The shifts in household routines, particularly the private consultations held by James and the attorney, introduced uncertainty into even the most mundane tasks. The kitchen, once a predictable arena of routine and order, now bore the subtle undercurrents of speculation and caution. Servants whispered in corners, their words measured, their trust carefully calibrated. Those who had once assumed certainty in their positions now questioned each gesture, each instruction, and each interaction. James, aware of this latent tension, sought to balance reassurance with authority, ensuring compliance while preventing overt fear from undermining household stability. In the afternoon, a brief council convened with the senior staff and overseers. Discussions focused on estate operations, inventory, and the management of property under the changing circumstances. Each participant spoke with a careful cadence, aware that words could carry unintended implications. James presided with a meticulous eye, observing not only the content of conversation but the subtleties of tone, posture, and hesitation. In Belmont Manor, he had learned that knowledge was inseparable from perception. A carefully worded directive could solidify loyalty or provoke resistance, depending on its reception. These sessions, while outwardly routine, became exercises in influence, negotiation, and control, shaping the invisible dynamics of authority that governed the estate, later in the day, and observed her brother Charles in the library, meticulously reviewing ledgers and cross-referencing them with correspondence. His face, usually impassive, betrayed fleeting traces of anxiety and frustration, and noted the manner in which he paused, the slight furrow of his brow, the deliberate avoidance of eye contact when she entered the room. Knowledge, she understood, was not evenly distributed, and the careful observation of human behavior often revealed more than formal records ever could. Belmont Manor was alive with these subtleties, a living network of influence, calculation, and anticipation. As dusk approached, the family gathered briefly in the parlor, a place of measured civility and careful performance. Conversations were precise, socially calibrated, and heavily laced with subtext. Every remark, every laugh, every pause carried significance beyond its immediate meaning. Belmont Manor, in all its grandeur, had become a theater in which observation, foresight, and psychological acuity defined authority as much as inheritance or legal standing. By nightfall, the estate settled into a tentative quiet. Candles flickered in the hallways, casting shadows that shifted with the movement of household members. Belmont Manor had become more than a residence. It was a crucible of perception, influence, and strategic patience. Every occupant, from family to staff, navigated its corridors with careful awareness, fully conscious that even the smallest gesture might alter the intricate balance of power. And as the moonlight traced the contours of the estate's stately exterior, James Whitfield reflected on the complex interplay of law, loyalty, and human behavior that defined the unfolding days of 1854. The night air settled over Belmont Manor like a heavy curtain, carrying with it the faint scent of magnolias and damp earth. Inside the grand halls, shadows stretched across polished floors, curling around furniture and portraits as though they had a life of their own. James Whitfield remained at his desk in the library, the flickering candlelight reflecting off brass fixtures and gilded edges of books. The documents before him were a tangled web of legal intricacies, personal correspondences, and estate ledgers, each demanding meticulous attention. Every line of ink held potential consequence, and he read each one with a precision that bordered on obsession. The weight of the family's expectations pressed upon him. But it was not merely responsibility that consumed his mind, it was the persistent awareness of fragility in every decision. The knowledge that a single misstep could unravel the delicate equilibrium carefully maintained for decades. Anne Whitfield, observing silently from the doorway, had perfected the art of watching without being seen. Her presence was felt only in the slightest shifts, a crease of the brow, a glance that lingered longer than necessary. She understood that Belmont Manor was as much a study of human behavior as it was a residence. Every whispered conversation, every glance exchanged between family members or servants, carried significance far beyond its surface meaning. In this environment, patience was power and subtlety often outweighed direct action. Anne had learned to catalog these subtleties with the precision of a scholar, understanding that insight often emerged from observation rather than declaration. In the servants' quarters, whispers moved like currents beneath the surface of everyday life. The household staff, attentive to the shifting dynamics above them, exchanged information in hushed tones. They noted not only the actions of the family, but the reactions, small hesitations, sudden changes in demeanor, the careful calibration of tone and posture. Even the smallest slip, a delayed response or unintended expression, could alter their perceived loyalty or usefulness. James, aware of these undercurrents, had initiated subtle measures to maintain order, blending reassurance with gentle authority, ensuring that the household continued to function while preserving the fragile hierarchy. By late evening, a gathering of the family and senior staff convened in the drawing room. The discussion, outwardly about estate management, concealed layers of strategy, observation, and negotiation. Each participant measured their words, understood the weight of silence, and navigated the unspoken rules that governed Belmont Manor. James presided with a quiet intensity, reading more than listening, observing more than speaking. The balance of power was never static. It shifted with every glance, every inflection, every decision rendered in private consultation. In this theater of subtle influence, the line between authority and perception became increasingly blurred. Anne watched as her brother Charles, normally confident, displayed fleeting uncertainty. His fingers drummed against the arm of his chair, a subtle manifestation of inner turmoil, and noted the nuance of his hesitation, cataloging it alongside similar observations from previous weeks. The manor had become a living organism, each occupant a participant in a complex network of influence, perception, and anticipation. Belmont Manor's grandeur masked an intricate social choreography where patience, observation, and strategy determined the fates of both family and staff. As midnight approached, the mansion fell into an uneasy quiet. Candlelight flickered and shadows deepened, exaggerating every movement. In the stillness, the weight of expectation and the subtle currents of tension seemed almost tangible. James Whitfield returned to his desk, fully aware that the unfolding days demanded not just careful action but constant vigilance. Every gesture, every word, every decision was a thread in the delicate tapestry of Belmont Manor, where human ambition, fragile alliances, and unspoken truths interwove to define life within its walls. The first hints of dawn seeped into Belmont Manor through heavy drapes, casting muted light across the polished floors and ornate furnishings. In the library, James Whitfield remained at his desk, hunched over ledgers and letters, each document a potential key to unraveling the increasingly complex web surrounding the estate. The previous weeks had brought subtle shifts, a servant's hesitation, a guest's carefully measured inquiry, the faint tension of a household under observation. Each incident, however small, resonated within the walls of Belmont Manor, and James approached them with the same meticulous scrutiny he applied to legal contracts. It had become apparent that control within the household was not merely a matter of authority. It was a function of perception, vigilance, and the careful orchestration of appearances. Anne Whitfield moved through the morning with the quiet precision that had become her signature. In the drawing room, she noticed the servants arranging furniture and preparing for the day, their movements deliberate and cautious. She registered the minor shifts in posture, the slight flinch when certain topics were mentioned, the way eyes darted toward corners of the room that should have been empty. Belmont Manor was a living system, responsive to human thought and emotion, and Anne's keen observations allowed her to anticipate disruptions before they fully materialized. Every glance, every pause, every unspoken reaction became part of a mental map she had constructed, charting influence and hierarchy with unwavering precision. Outside, the estate grounds reflected the household's inner tension. The gardens, meticulously maintained yet strangely quiet, carried a sense of latent anxiety. Servants moved between hedges and flower beds with the same careful attention to detail that characterized their indoor duties, their eyes constantly scanning for signals from the house above. The estate's physical beauty, its white columns and manicured lawns, belied the undercurrents of uncertainty that pulsed beneath the surface. Belmont Manor's outward serenity masked an intricate web of observation, influence and anticipation, where each action and inaction could ripple outward, affecting alliances and loyalty in ways that remained largely invisible to outsiders. Mid-morning brought the arrival of a visiting attorney, his purpose ostensibly to review property records. Though James was aware of subtler motives, the attorney's demeanor was polite, almost cordial. But James detected the careful weighing of each word, the meticulous measurement of reactions, the invisible ledger of impressions being compiled with each passing moment. Belmont Manor was as much a theater of psychological acuity as it was a residence of wealth and status. Observing human behavior with precision became a necessity, and James had long mastered the art of reading subtle cues, interpreting micro-expressions, and predicting outcomes based on fleeting indications. Throughout the afternoon, household activities proceeded under this tense scrutiny. The kitchen, once a hub of routine and familiarity, now operated with a heightened sense of awareness. Orders were executed with precision, yet an undercurrent of speculation permeated every task. Servants whispered in corners, noting the minutiae of conversations, the subtle indications of anxiety, the hints of secrets that threaded through the estate's corridors. Belmont Manor, in its grandeur, had become a crucible for human behavior, a place where perception often outweighed formal authority, where power was measured not only by social standing but by insight, and the ability to navigate hidden currents. As evening approached, James convened a brief council in the drawing room, reviewing the day's developments with a careful eye. Every word spoken, every expression observed was catalogued in his mind. The day's subtleties had revealed patterns, small threads of influence and intention that demanded attention. Belmont Manor's inhabitants, from family to staff, moved through an invisible lattice of expectation, observation, and strategic discretion. Each interaction, each hesitation, each carefully chosen phrase shaped the delicate balance of control that governed the estate. And James understood that mastery of this invisible realm was essential for survival, influence, and the preservation of both legacy and order. Night settled over Belmont Manor like a heavy, suffocating blanket, pressing against the walls and seeping into every room. Candles flickered in their sconces, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move independently, twisting and contorting along the ornate paneling. The manor, though physically unchanging, had grown stranger in the night since the scandalous discovery of the attorney's letters. Whispers traveled faster than footsteps, and the air carried a weight of suspicion that settled uneasily over both family and servants. James Whitfield, seated in the study, kept his mind focused on the task before him, though the edges of perception had become sharper and more perilous. Every creak of the floorboards, every shuffle in the hallway, demanded his attention. Each subtle noise was catalogued, evaluated, and weighed against the tapestry of events slowly unraveling within Belmont Manor. Anne Whitfield, moving quietly along the corridors, had developed a heightened sense of the house's hidden rhythms. She observed not only the movements of those around her, but the pauses, the silences, the spaces where conversation failed to penetrate. It was in these gaps that Belmont Manor revealed its truer nature, a structure defined as much by what remained unspoken as by what was openly acknowledged. Servants whispered about unusual occurrences, a book left open on a table, a chair slightly moved from its usual place, the faint sound of someone crying in a room long thought empty, and catalogued each incident meticulously, understanding that in a house so steeped in observation and counter-observation, nothing was accidental, nothing truly unnoticed. Downstairs in the main hall, a quiet confrontation had occurred between two of the senior servants. Their voices were soft, careful, almost conspiratorial, but the tension between them was palpable. James, who had been consulting the estate ledger in the adjoining room, could feel the subtle vibrations of unease, the energy that had begun to permeate Belmont Manor like a low hum. Each word exchanged, each small gesture, was a thread in a web that had grown increasingly complex. Control within the house was no longer merely a matter of authority. It had become an intricate interplay of influence, perception, and psychological acuity. By midnight, James found himself once again alone in the study. The room seemed to breathe with its own life, the faint rustle of curtains and the low sighs of the mansion amplifying the sensation of surveillance and tension. Letters from distant relatives lay scattered across the desk, many bearing requests or veiled inquiries regarding the family's business affairs, while others contained hints of concern or perhaps judgment regarding the ongoing events within the manor. James read each one with an intensity that bordered on obsession, weighing the potential implications of every phrase, every insinuation, and every carefully chosen word. Belmont Manor had become a nexus of human intention, subtle manipulation and latent power struggles, and to navigate it required both patience and an acute understanding of human behavior. Meanwhile, and moved toward the west wing, her path deliberate, her steps soundless against the polished floors. She paused outside a particular door, noting the subtle shift in temperature, the faint creak of the hinges that seemed to sigh under unseen weight. Within the house, shadows deepened, creating forms that mimicked the movements of those who occupied the rooms, blurring lines between reality and perception. The mansion's inhabitants, from the Whitfield family to the loyal servants, had adapted to this new, unspoken dynamic where every glance, every whispered word, and every movement became a potential source of information. Influence or threat, asterisk, by the early hours? Belmont Manor had settled into an uneasy slumber, though the tension remained palpable. James and Anne, though physically separated by rooms and responsibilities, shared a silent understanding of the forces at play, an understanding that spoke to the delicate balance of control, observation, and anticipation that defined life within the grand walls. In the silence, the mansion's legacy of secrecy and psychological nuance continued to unfold, its invisible currents shaping the fates of those who dwelled within its corridors, as the shadows of the night stretched long and inescapable. The morning after the manor's uneasy night dawned gray and cold, a light mist curling over the estate grounds. Belmont Manor seemed transformed, the fog giving even familiar corners an unfamiliar edge, obscuring the line between garden and forest, hallway and shadowed chamber. James Whitfield moved through the corridors with the precision of a man accustomed to constant vigilance. The previous week's tension had sharpened every sense. His ears picked up the slightest creak of a floorboard, his eyes noted the tiniest deviations in arrangement. He had learned, almost instinctively, that Belmont Manor functioned as a living organism, its pulse dictated not by its architecture but by the subtle behaviors and hidden fears of its inhabitants. In the East Wing, and Whitfield quietly prepared for the arrival of an unexpected visitor, magistrate from Savannah, who had requested to inspect certain ledgers and correspondences, and noted the slight tremor in the hands of the housekeeper as she arranged the drawing room, the nervous shift of the foot of the butler, whose loyalty had been both tested and rewarded over decades. Belmont Manor had long relied on routines to maintain stability, but recent disruptions, the whispered accusations, the letters intercepted before delivery, the subtle rearrangement of furniture had begun to erode the predictability the household once depended upon. Anne's role had shifted from passive observation to active management of tension, a delicate balancing act requiring both psychological acuity and careful diplomacy. James received the magistrate with his usual formal courtesy, presenting ledgers and documents with meticulous care. Yet beneath the surface, a complex mental calculus was at play, each statement measured for double meaning, each document scanned for potential misinterpretation. The magistrate's questions were pointed but polite, probing the layers of Belmont Manor's legal and financial integrity, yet James could sense an undercurrent of suspicion in the older man's tone. Belmont Manor's walls seemed to close in around them, the air thick with a shared awareness of unspoken truths and carefully concealed secrets. Every gesture, every inflection, every hesitation carried weight far beyond what the casual observer could perceive. Outside, servants moved cautiously through the fog-laden gardens. Their tasks, routine by design, had grown fraught with anxiety, for each action could be interpreted as compliance or defiance, trust or betrayal. The delicate dance of loyalty and observation, always present within Belmont Manor, had intensified. Shadows lengthened in corners of the estate where the fog mingled with late autumn light, creating shapes that seemed to flicker between reality and imagination. Belmont Manor, for all its grandeur and carefully maintained order, had become a theater in which every inhabitant, whether family or staff, played a role of measured caution, where psychological precision determined survival as much as social position. By mid-afternoon, tension had reached a peak. The magistrate departed with his notes, leaving an undercurrent of uncertainty in his wake. James and Anne, reunited in the drawing room, shared a silent acknowledgment of the fragility of control within the manor. Words were unnecessary. The accumulated knowledge of observation, experience, and careful deduction sufficed. Belmont Manor's delicate equilibrium remained intact, though only just. The estate's physical beauty concealed a far more complex reality, a network of observation, anticipation, and subtle manipulation, where the truth existed as much in what was hidden as in what was revealed. As evening fell, The fog returned, denser and more insistent, wrapping the manor in a cloak of gray silence. In the library, James Whitfield reviewed the day's developments once more. Understanding that Belmont Manor's true narrative existed in layers private, observed, concealed, and only partially documented. Outside, shadows stretched longer, wind whispered through leafless trees, and the estate's occupants moved with a heightened awareness, knowing that every action, every glance, and every word could alter the balance of power within the sprawling manor. The tension would persist, as it always had, until the final truths buried in Belmont Manor's history could be fully revealed. Asterisk. Night fell over Belmont Manor with a weight that seemed almost tangible, pressing down on the slate roofs and polished floors, seeping into every hidden corner of the estate. The house, with its grand chandeliers, paneled walls, and heavy curtains, had long been a stage for secrets, whispers, and careful observation. But on this night the tension had reached a point of silent culmination. The accumulated weight of suspicion, grief, and restrained anxiety settling into a dense atmosphere that seemed to breathe alongside its human occupants. James Whitfield, seated at his desk in the study, reviewed letters and accounts one final time, aware that every detail, every ledger entry, every correspondence was a fragment of a story, far larger than the mere sum of its parts. Asterisk. The servants moved through the hallways with an almost ceremonial quiet, each step calculated, each glance measured. Shadows stretched across the polished floors, and the faint glow of candlelight revealed not just objects, but the subtle tremors in the hands of those charged with maintaining order. Belmont Manor had always demanded vigilance, but recent events had taught that vigilance alone could not safeguard truth or stability. Secrets had multiplied, layered over one another, each revelation like a stone placed upon an already fragile structure. And Whitfield, aware of the subtle undercurrents of fear and expectation, moved carefully through the drawing room, arranging objects as she had done countless times before, knowing that even the smallest adjustment could influence perception, alter interpretation, and preserve control. Asterisk. James, conscious of the manor's unspoken laws and the fragile ecosystem of observation and influence, reflected on the cumulative weight of the past weeks. Letters intercepted, conversations overheard, and hidden movements recorded a narrative that official documents could not capture. Belmont Manor was a vessel of human psychology, a crucible in which loyalty, fear, grief, and cunning intermingled. The estate itself seemed alive, responding to the unspoken energies of its inhabitants, shaping behavior and silently recording the traces of human thought. Even as the walls themselves remained indifferent to suffering or triumph. Asterisk. By midnight, the house was quiet, yet the tension remained palpable. James moved from the study to the library, noting the careful alignment of books and the faint indentation of a chair recently vacated. The flicker of candlelight cast long, ambiguous shadows across the room, shapes that could be interpreted as specters or merely the product of imagination heightened by isolation. Belmont Manor had always contained these ambiguities, spaces where perception and reality intertwined, and where the hidden machinations of human behavior were mirrored in the architecture itself. Asterisk. Anne, observing from the hallway, noted the precision of her brother's movements, the careful pauses, the methodical attention to detail. They were the final guardians of a house built upon layers of secrecy, of decisions made in shadows, of knowledge that existed only in careful observation and meticulous record-keeping. Belmont Manor, in all its grandeur, had become a repository of human complexity, grief unexpressed, intentions hidden, truths partially revealed, and actions measured with almost surgical precision. Asterisk. As the first gray light of dawn touched the estate grounds, James and Anne shared a silent understanding. Belmont Manor, for all its hidden histories and untold stories, remained unchanged outwardly, yet inwardly it was a place where human resilience, cunning, and endurance were tested to their limits. The final lesson of Belmont Manor was clear. Truth exists not only in records and letters, but in observation, in memory. And in the shadows where human emotion and action leave their indelible marks, Asterisk the story of Belmont Manor, the scandal that had begun with the attorney's discovery, and the intricate lives of those trapped within its walls remained a testament to human endurance, perception, and the enduring complexity of morality. Shadows may recede, secrets may fade, and time may erode even the grandest edifices. But the echoes of human experience, the choices, the fears, the cunning, the grief persist, waiting for those willing to observe, to reflect, and to understand. Belmont Manor was more than a house. It was a mirror of human nature, a stage upon which the subtleties of life and the weight of hidden truths played out, quietly and relentlessly, for those who dared to pay attention. Asterisk,